That's the way it is now. I'm really excited to be here. I just realized that I'm going to talk about sexual orientation in a church. So that's a little exciting, I think. I'm here today to talk to you about stories, and we're going to try to make a case for why we should look at the stories. And specifically, I'm going to look at a study that I've done with Saskia Kühnen from my department, Developmental Psychology, and Fiona Tasker, who is a researcher at Birkbeck College in London. And I'm going to do this by highlighting a study on 8 young gay men who were kind enough to tell us their stories of self-acceptance. First of all, I want to talk a little about stories generally, because stories, I think, are very central to our personal lives and the communities we're part of. If you think of how we teach people about the social world and the rules in it, stories play a fundamental part in, for example, teaching children gender roles, or how to face the dangers of a social world. And they can be used to teach new morals and values, for example, in this recently published book on King and King, which is sort of a new twist on the fairy tale story of Prince and Princess. But stories don't only mirror our world, they also frame how we understand the events that occur in it. And if you think of war stories, for example, which commonly feature heroes and villains, so either heroes or villains, or the other way around, villains and heroes, depending on what side of the conflict you're on, then it becomes very clear that stories do a lot for how we understand our lives. And this is specifically true for our individuals' lives. Stories help us to explain events that occur in our own lived experiences. And in narrative analysis, we look usually at 2 kinds of stories, either macro stories, which are long-lasting life stories, and micro stories, which are stories that just happen, this morning I went to the supermarket, and that might be a story I might tell. It's important to point out that the events that we talk about don't necessarily or logically or immediately inform the stories that we tell. Instead of being minuscule descriptions of sort of moment-by-moment lines of how things happened, stories are selective accounts of the things that we perceive as having happened. And this becomes very clear if you think about where to start a story. I think we're really used to telling stories and listening to stories, so much in fact that we forget how peculiar the start of a story can be. Think, for example, of a story of sexual self-acceptance. Where should such a story start? I mean, at birth, maybe. If you're part of a collectivistic culture, maybe you talk about your parents meeting. In the study that we did, participants commonly talk about the very first moment that they realized the same-sex attraction, which either was by falling in love with a friend or, alternatively, by having the first same-sex contact. The point here is that stories reflect what a participant thinks, or a narrator thinks, is part of the account, and what does not belong to the account, so what is causally related to something or not. Next to starts and ends, stories also have other elements, and William Leboff did a study on how people talk when they tell stories. What he found is that there is 6 common elements. When telling a story, people give an abstract. They will tell you what the story is going to be about. And then they're going to give you a little orientation, telling you exactly who, what, and where sort of the story is about. And then something happens, a complicating action, something that kicks off the story, that is then being evaluated in terms of its emotional impact on the narrator. And eventually, most stories feature a resolution. Whatever the problem, it will come to an end and is going to be resolved. And in some stories, participants also then will highlight in a coda how whatever happened in the story relates now to their present-day experience. It's important to point out that participants don't construct stories based on these criteria. We don't have a list that we go through when telling a story. But they can help us to understand similarities across often very different and diverse life experiences. Because some participants, for example, might not use an abstract, and that might say something. Or if you think of a story that does not have a resolution, that might just indicate that for the participant or the narrator, the story isn't over yet, and there is no resolution to be found. And so by looking at these common features, we can learn more about shared experiences. The specific study I'm talking about today is a study that we did a couple of years ago, so 2 years, on 8 young gay men from Germany who were kind enough to volunteer for this project, and who were interviewed by me. And we sit in a room, a little microphone, and then there's a bit of silence. And then you ask them one very simple question, which is, how did your sexuality develop? And they press start, and they just talk. And interesting enough, people will give a quite well-rounded account of the story, which we then analyzed. What we found is that participants' stories generally conform to a well-known genre of sexuality stories, which are that of struggle, so struggling with who you are and coming to terms with being gay or having same-sex attraction, and then succeeding in that, and sort of experiencing acceptance of yourself. And so that is what we found in our stories too. But we realized, and which is something that has not been looked at before, is that there is a critical moment, a turning point at which struggle turns into success. And specifically, these stories, these turning points, are illustrated in little episodes featuring a relative stranger, someone who the participant is not friends with. It's not a family member. It is someone like your psychologist, a Reiki practitioner. It was a mom, the wife of someone's Boy Scouts leader. A couple that someone met in a BDSM sex club that really helped them to understand that it's okay to be gay. And these people, as diverse as they might be, share 2 common features. They are open and very liberal in some cases, and they're accessible. It's actually possible to talk to them. And most of the research on narratives looks at what people attend to, what people talk about. But one of the important things that we realized looking at our stories is that you should also look at the things that people attend to, but that then don't happen. This is this little episode that a participant called Most is talking about in relation to his high school headmaster, who was openly gay, but distant, and therefore didn't allow for a turning point to materialize. And he describes it as follows. In that sense, our principal was gay, but he was very distant. Well, you didn't really have a relationship with him, and you didn't really get to know him. So that really didn't help either. I just always regretted that. I'd hoped that, especially in this matter, where our principal is gay, that there would have been some more sex ed classes, that you'd have some contact to some gays. And I think it's really easy to see the frustration about this sort of not materialized thing, the thing that could have happened but didn't happen. The last bit that Most talked about is something that we find in many orientations. In fact, in half of the orientations that we looked at our stories, is that in the period of struggle, participants describe isolation from other gay peers. There are no gay men in their life. And in fact, Friedrich puts it like this. Well, my circle of acquaintances or friends, I don't think there was anyone who was like gay or lesbian. No, I think there was nothing. And personally, I think that this in itself is really interesting to look at. That studying stories makes sense because they're the experience of people who often don't get to say much. Most of studies on sexual identity development in gay youth, for example, focuses on stigma and on struggle and on problems. But our studies show that people actively manage to overcome these problems, and I think we should adopt sort of a more listening approach. And these, I think, insights, first, the idea that there is turning points involving people who are not friends or family, and this relative isolation, they're contrasting a lot of the research that is out there on gay identity development. Most stage theories of sexual identity development in gay and lesbian teenagers focus on a period right before acceptance that is involved with a lot of immersion. People immerse themselves in gay culture, they make gay friends, and that's how they learn to be okay with being gay. And our study shows that's maybe not true, at least not in the stories that they tell, because all of that happens after. And studies usually highlight how important peers are in the development of sexual identity in minority youth. And also that might not be entirely true all the time. So I think, if anything, or if nothing, what we might learn from stories is that stuff is more complex than we originally might have thought. And certainly I think that if we go on and study identity development, we should look at what the participants think is important, what they are into as being fundamental in their process. A narrative analysis can be a very good tool for this. And especially looking at the role of sort of relative strangers and of their openness and accessibility, I think what we can learn from this study, at least a little bit, is how to foster identity development that is adaptive in sexual minority youth, which I think is an exciting thing to do. This is my idea. You know, we all should listen to stories now. Not all the time, maybe, but every now and then to get an idea of what's actually going on. I would very quickly like to thank Fiona, who's not here, but who's been really patient with me in this project. And I would like to thank all of you for being so patient and waiting until the break. Thank you so much.
You can give it to Monica.